own the rights to the music used in our podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Fantastic, the podcast about exploring disabilities here on Straight Independent Talk Radio. My name is Samantha Pierce, the Idea Dynamo, and I am your host. We are going to be talking about all things disability. So we all know that we are all still working from home, and we are all up in our spaces, sharing spaces with our families. And so sometimes our families, as we social distance together, will show up on screen in the audio. So give yourselves a little bit of grace and give us a little bit of grace, because we do have our families all here with us, sharing our space and living that life fantastic. And I am joined by a panel of guests, and we'll start off with you, Liza. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Liza Citron. I am an education student, specifically going into the field of elementary inclusive education, and I am also autistic myself, along with being disabled in other ways. I've had a lot of things that I have seen in terms of inadequacies in the way disabled people are treated, and just the fact that we are treated differently. And that is essentially what I endeavor to fix, even if it's only in one person's life, as much as I'd like to make real policy changes. I'm also interested in social sciences, arts, anything of that sort. And that's basically it about me. Disabled, autistic, social scientist, and person.
Scott, introduce yourself for us.
Yes, I'm Scott Davis. I am a disability advocate and a writer and speaker, having been early on diagnosed as a failure to thrive, and my mom and dad and the right therapist busted that myth, and I'm thriving and doing well. And I love to advocate for those with disabilities, and I mentor someone through my local church. And it's just a great privilege as the Chief Encouraging Officer of Life to be on the show. Thank you for the opportunity.
My name is Jeremy Pierce. I am a philosophy professor, and I am married to Samantha, and
Woo-hoo!
She can introduce herself and our family.
So, as I said, my name is Samantha Pierce. I am the creator of this show. I am a disability advocate, parent of people with disabilities, and I'm autistic myself. So we're going to move right along and get to the topic that we're going to talk about today. And in the news, we have heard about a young autistic boy. His name is, where'd it go? Linden Cameron, who was shot by police in the back after his mother called 911 to get help for him, because he was having some mental health issues at the time, and she needed help getting him to the hospital. And this is something that is, I want to say a common occurrence, but this does happen. We have mental health issues and mental health challenges that we need care for to help get us the care that we need. And sometimes it goes wrong, as in this case, where a 13-year-old child is hospitalized with severe gunshot wounds. So I want to talk a little bit about what is the state of mental health care for people on the autism spectrum and for people with how do we access that care, and what kind of training that police officers receive when it comes to interacting with people with disabilities and people who are having mental health episodes and they really need help. So Liza, I'm going to start with you. What was your first impression when you read this news story about young Linden?
I've seen in others' lives and my own life the inadequacies of mental health care in disabled people, in treating disabled people, because there are either different things that go on or different societal barriers we have to go through, and the treatment there can be different. And when ableism and assumption of people's worth comes into play, whether practitioners realize it or not, that's going to affect the care they give. And I think that affects the system of care that we have and the way people react. I also think that in general, the article said that mental health professionals were going to be sent out with police in the future. That's the way it should always have been. Police are not the first solution to a mental health crisis. I agree that in cases of violence or in cases of the person being armed or anything of that sort, yes,
Liza, can you hold
they
on a minute?
should be.
Because
Yeah,
Liza, can you hold on? My connection is a bit of a mess, so I am going
that's
to.
yours.
I'm going to connect to a different network, and then you know, we can start over. Sorry.
Okay.
All right, so starting over from this point. Liza, let's start with you and give me your impression of when you first read the Washington Post article about this young boy who was shot by the police, who his mother had called for help.
Well, I've personally seen in my own life, as well as the lives of others that I've known, that there are certain inadequacies present in mental health care as it relates to disabilities. There are different societal barriers we face. There are different issues that can go on because the way our brains are made up, brain chemistry and all of that, can affect the way in which certain mental issues, illnesses present. I also think that the article said that in the future, mental health professionals were going to be sent out with police to deal with these sorts of calls. And I thought to myself, this is the way it's supposed to be. That is the way it should have been from the beginning. Now, I understand that in cases of violence or armed robbery or any case where the individual themselves is armed, yes, we may need police there. But even in those cases, do not send them as the only response there. That will just lead to problems with the police on the scene being under-equipped and just not being the right people to be there. We have trained mental health professionals for a reason. Why is it that we can use them on an appointment and walk-in basis, but we don't have any of them in our police departments or working with our first responders?
Right. And that, I'm glad that you bring that up, because the Syracuse City Police Department, they are pursuing, you know, at the behest of families like my own, training in crisis intervention for the purposes of when there is a mental health related call, the people who show up know what they're doing. And recently there was a news story indicating that when that training was offered, only a handful of officers took advantage of that, which is a little bit problematic, because I think officers realize that they are being called to all sorts of things in the community, and you really don't want to be the officer who, you know, someone calls you for help and you end up injuring that person. Personally, we have had relatively good interactions with our neighborhood police officers when we have interacted with them for our kiddos. We've never had to make a mental health call, however. I do know that a lot of families, because of, you know, the lack of mental health care for people with autism in particular and other developmental disabilities, oftentimes the only help they can get is by calling police officers and helping and having the officers help get to a hospital where they can get some sort of care. And, you know, in a situation where the officers showing up might not be equipped to provide the help that you need, and might end up in a situation like this situation in Salt Lake City, where instead of helping the person, they injure them. That's nerve-wracking for families to have to be aware that that's the situation that they're in. Scott, I want to bring you in and ask you, what was your first reaction, and have you ever had to interact with police officers as a disabled person and get their help for anything?
No, I really haven't. Only time I really interacted with them was when my cab didn't show up at the mall at like 1 o'clock, but my Fairfield cab came. It was just Bridgeport didn't respond, so that was when I was younger. I wasn't threatened or anything, but basically when I read the article, it mentioned something about separation anxiety, but also it's the idea of expectations. It's extremely hard because as an adult and even as a child or a teenager, I process things very differently. And even on a level of teenagers teasing me, they didn't quite understand or get me. And even the doctors when I was born, they didn't quite understand or how to deal with someone with multiple disabilities. And we can explore that in the future of how do you fit in that expectation, and how are you going to expect this 13-year-old that has separation anxiety, has all kinds of fears and problems. And even in today's news, you don't know if someone's armed or not, and they did say that possibly to do a stun pellet or something, but you don't need force, or just try to tackle them gently. There's ways to address these situations. I know I'm going around it several different ways, but it's just the main statement is that there's, how do you place an expectation? It's very hard to train disabled people, and even I with a disability, in terms of processing information, it's sometimes hard for the information to stick.
Yeah.
And if you're in that crisis, how are you going to make it stick? How are you going to help that person to really make sense of it? Because if I was in that situation, and I'd freak out if I saw the police. If I didn't, they should train families. They should have families somehow have meetings with the police and do role plays.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and I love that you got to the point of expectations. What were the expectations of the family when they called for help, and what were the expectations of the officers when they arrived? Do we really train officers to know what to expect when they go out for a mental health call? Do we train them to be able to discern this person is experiencing a mental health episode, or this person has a disability that's affecting their behavior? Do we really give officers the tools to be able to make those distinctions when they go out essentially to do their job at, serving and protecting the community? And Jeremy, you've been quiet, so I want to tap into you and hear what's going on in your head with respect to this case where a family calls for help and they end up having a family member injured by the people that they called for help.
So obviously something went wrong in communication here. This woman called for help, and somehow the cop who arrived on the scene heard a message that said someone had a weapon, when that wasn't part of the original message. Now, unless someone else called in and said that, in which case, I mean, you just can't control random callers who lie or who make things up. But police are supposed to be trained to assess a situation first before shooting. And there's been so many cases of that where they haven't, and someone has been shot when they shouldn't have been, that they should know better by now. So obviously this cop either wasn't trained right or wasn't vetted right to have that job. But apparently something went wrong in the communication as well. Who was it that converted that message into saying there was a weapon? So that's something they need to track down. They need to to think through what went wrong here in the communication. They should have an electronic trail for every transfer of message, or they should be recording all of the radio traffic. If they're not, they need to, so that they can know who's responsible for that, and they need to make sure they deal with that situation, because that's someone who shouldn't be in that kind of job. The information that gets through between the person who calls 911 and the police officer responding to any incident needs to be a perfect transfer of information without extra things thrown in that that are going to get someone hurt. So, I mean, that's one thing that could have been easily avoidable if people had done their jobs, and they didn't. As for the issue of police versus social workers or whoever responds, I don't see why it's a problem if police are the ones who show up, but they need to be trained right, and they need to know how to deal with situations like this. There's no reason a police officer can't get the same training that a social worker gets in terms of how to deal with someone. Obviously, they have a different task. They're trying to achieve something different. But if there's police that are not able to handle this, then they're not being trained right. They're not being expected to behave the way. I don't understand so much why we would have to say it needs to be a different occupation that responds to this, as much as whoever responds to it needs to know how to handle this kind of situation. It's not so much about the occupation in my mind. It's more about, do they know what they're doing? Do they know how to handle this? Do they have the ability to handle this? And that kind of thing. And it may be the job of 911 dispatchers to figure that out, or maybe it's the job of whoever's in charge of the police force that day. I don't know who makes those decisions, but just sending the closest officer is fine if all the officers are equally well trained. But maybe that's not going to work. I don't know. I mean, I don't know their police force. They do, and someone should be the one who thinks about those questions. My guess is they probably don't have someone thinking about those questions.
And you make great points in that, you know, every officer should be equipped with the tools to effectively evaluate a situation and be able to tell, oh, this is someone who is having a mental health episode, so I need to respond this way, or this is someone who has a developmental disability, so the way that I would normally react is not going to work for this person. You're right that every officer should have that kind of training, and it doesn't, you know, in that case, we don't really need to say, well, no, we should send out someone else with a different job title to do this, because officers interact with all kinds of people every day. And yes, they should be equipped to be able to navigate an interaction with someone with a developmental disability without injuring the person. They should be able to navigate a situation with someone with, you know, experiencing their mental illness without injuring that person. And we've seen in the news of late situations where officers were called to assist someone with a mental illness, and they end up injuring or killing them. We've seen situations where people with developmental disabilities, specifically autism, encounter police and they don't survive. So that's problematic. That needs to stop happening. You know, myself as a parent, I need to know that when my children interact with police officers, regardless of the reason why, they are going to survive that interaction. Now, I want to pivot for a moment to oh, my pen's exploding. The mental health services that are available to people with developmental disabilities. Now, we know that mental health care is not a priority in a lot of communities, in a lot of cultures. And so it is something that has been underfunded, kind of pushed to the wayside. What we're finding as well is that the mental health services that are available in various communities are not appropriate to meet the needs of people with developmental disabilities. And the articles that I've read about Linden don't say what kind of mental health services he had access to, but we do know that in the middle of a crisis, his mother thought that the best option for her was to call 911 and ask for help. And we see how that turned out. So I want to talk a little bit more now about the state of mental health services, and especially the state of mental health services for people with developmental disabilities and autism. Because one of the things that we know from research, and we know this, it's all the clinicians, the scientists, they know that people with autism and people with developmental disabilities, we are at higher risk for mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. Do they know how to treat us? Do we often get access? Not really. So Liza, I want you to take a stab at this first, because you, like myself, are autistic. We are autistic women, which puts a different spin on things. So talk a little bit about how you experience the state of mental health services.
Well, first I want to say that Linden's mother did not only call the police to intervene, she specifically called them for help getting him to a hospital, whether that is a mental health hospital like CPEP in Syracuse, or whether that is a general hospital like Krause or anything of the sort. She thought that that was the best place for him at the time. But the fact is that mental health services are under-equipped to handle developmentally disabled people, especially autistic people, and especially people who don't present in a typical way. Sam, you touched on being autistic women. There is a whole bunch of stigma around that. And that stigma is something that mental health professionals may not be able to avoid and may be playing into without themselves realizing it. So minimizing the struggles of autistic women, assuming that they can't be autistic, if you will, in the same way as their male peers. And of course, sexism plays into that a good bit. But regardless, when we're talking about mental health in terms of autism, I know that at least for me, and I've heard that this is true from studies and from other autistic people, we sometimes are not able to articulate the way in which our thoughts are occurring, because there's a massive difference, and I speak from experience here, there's a massive difference between something popping into your head like, oh, what would happen if I took this knife? Or what would happen if I jumped off this bridge? Just an intrusive thought, rather than I want to take this knife or I want to jump off this bridge. There is a massive difference, and we're often unable to articulate that. And that often means we're placed in scenarios which are not the proper scenario for what we're going through. I had been in CPEP for, I think, 3 times, and once they figured out that nothing was actually happening, they had to discharge me and put me on medication. But that was exclusively because I wasn't able to articulate to them that it was an intrusive thought, and they thought that it was a real threat. And there are these rules around when you admit someone, and I understand the need to be better safe than sorry, but there needs to be more understanding and more discussion with disabled people, especially autistic people, in therapy or in whatever mental health practitioner is treating them, to actually understand the root of all this. Because it's not always I want to do this. It's sometimes a thought that pops into our head, or the running, which the police officer found threatening. That is not a threat. We're not able to articulate that because sometimes we don't even know it, but our brains are constantly in fight or flight due to an overactive amygdala. And that those hormones and that neurology there cause us to behave in ways that are different. And if people don't realize that, whether that's police officers, mental health practitioners, anything, then they are not going to realize the way in which we are being treated or what they actually need to do for us, because they can't understand the actual root of the behavior.
Yeah. And I want to go back to that point you made about the intrusive thoughts. Okay, I'm really good at that. I'm always thinking, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? It's come in really handy as a parent, especially as a parent of some like really creative and inventive children whose sense of self-preservation is not as strong and as healthy as I would like. So, you know, I'm driving across a bridge. I'm thinking, okay, what happens if this car all of a sudden goes off the side of the bridge? Okay, I've got a plan. I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt. I'm going to make sure everybody's seatbelts are unbuckled. This is how we're going to get out of the car. This is how I'm going to get all 5 of the children out of the car with me. Okay, that one knows how to swim. That one knows how to swim. That one doesn't know how to swim and is going to panic. So that's the one I'm going to go for first and make sure that I think about everything like this, to the point where it's almost like I can predict the future because I've already run through all the scenarios in my head. And there was a time where I was worried, is this suicidal ideation? And, you know, I had to have a therapist explain, no, that's just, you know, you're just focusing on like the worst possible scenario and running that through your head and making sure that you can, you know, you have your plan in place. Oh, okay, so someone else who was not as careful in thinking about these kinds of things might have said to me at the time, yeah, that is suicidal ideation. You know, later on in my life, when I did have an episode of suicidal ideation, it felt completely different. I'm like, oh, this is what people mean by that. And, you know, getting through that was something completely different. And getting through that, having a therapist to walk me through that, is like, okay, are you okay now? Yeah, I'm okay now, because it scared the heck out of me. And having access to mental health care professionals who can make the distinction between the intrusive thoughts and suicidal ideation, and understand the way that our, you know, for autistic people at least, the way that our brains may perseverate on an idea and like work it, you know, roll it over in our heads over and over and over and examine all the different pieces. It's really important having access to someone who can do that. Now, Liza, you and we're pretty good with the verbiage, with the words coming out of our mouths. For individuals like my son, who they are not interested in verbal communication, mental health world doesn't really know what to do with people who can't do talk therapy. And we've seen that firsthand. Go ahead, Liza.
I think it's especially complicated in terms of the inability to articulate when you may not be having suicidal ideation specifically, but you are having that feeling of, I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this anymore. But you don't want to do what is popping into your head, but you're also thinking, would this stop it? Even if you don't want to do it, in your mind, you're thinking, would this achieve the goal I am thinking of right now? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm like, oh, that's how I explain that. Because yes, I've done that. There's been a situation where, like, you know what, I am so done with this. I don't want to do it. But you know intellectually that actually, no, you can't be done. You got to go and take care of the things and handle your business. But dang it, if life had a pause switch right now, I would so hit that button and be done. Scott and Jeremy, you guys have been very quiet, so I want to give you a chance to speak. Scott, you go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Obviously, it's okay. I understand there's great ideas that come from women, and thank you for sharing, because it gives good insight. I would say definitely with the idea of mental health, I've shared on programs in the past with like Fantastic and different forms, that it's good to have in the schools mental health psychologists and not to have a negative perception of them, because I use them a lot, especially trying to transition from different areas of life, whether it's from junior high to high school or from high school to college. And it helps to discuss things, and helps to, even one time the therapist helped me just to take a few minutes to put my books in order. I still need help with that, but it didn't cure the problem. But it gave me the opportunity to talk about my problems. I was bullied a lot because I came from a private school in Long Island, Henry Viscardi School, and I went into the Fairfield Public Schools to Osborne Hill and Fairfield Woods and Andrew Ward. And they didn't really, the kids didn't really understand or get me because I was different. I didn't have a rule book to follow. I'm placed in a classroom with 20 or 30 able-bodied students. Take a test. I had no clue exactly what that meant. How do you fill this question out? And I interrupted, and they gave me candy bars and trying to help me. The teachers gave me that. They took me aside. I had people from the community, and it's good to volunteer with the community and reach out to someone that's different, because that helped a lot. I was coached in swimming, just having interaction just with a family, that helped a lot. That's the problem with hidden disabilities, like mine. It's hard when you can box it. You can't box the disability in. And when you're bullied, it's very tough. And and especially when you have a spectrum with autism, I've read articles that there's a spectrum of disabilities. Any disability that you have, there's severe, there's less severe. You can train people, but it's hard to really train them effectively, I think, because there are so many variables. People are processing the information differently. And also, one thing I would love, addressing the police issue, I would love to have homes, the police officers know that there's an autistic kid or someone that might react this way, and that they're trained on their beat, that if they're there, they should just listen and they should think and they shouldn't react. Because a lot of times when I'm in this COVID era, when I want something really badly, I'll just have an argument with a family member. But if I would just stop and listen and think, and I think if police would do that too, it would make everything much smoother. But I'm sorry, training might help, but there are so many variables that it's very difficult to come up with this scenario, because it's going on all throughout history. Mm-hmm. But maybe the article will change it.
I like that you point to officers knowing their neighborhoods and knowing their beats and knowing their neighbors, so that they know, who in the neighborhood might be autistic. That's kind of the situation that we have in our neighborhood with the officers who work on our side of the town. They all know him. They all know my son, and those who have, the longer they've been on this beat on this side of the town, the more they know him. There are some officers who have known my son since he was a little kid, a little peanut, trying to go, take a walk without an adult through the neighborhood. And so they know him, they know how to approach him. They've taken the time to earn his trust. And so what I hear you saying, Scott, is that we need to get back to that with policing, where officers get to know the people in the neighborhoods where they're walking their beats, where they earn the trust of the people in those neighborhoods, so that they can be effective at their jobs. And you mentioned something earlier where families and officers meet and get to know each other. And I think that's really important, because what is going to help officers be effective and be able to, as you pointed out, respond rather than react in a way that might cause an innocent person harm, is by exposure, like exposure to all the variables on that spectrum when it comes to disability and when it comes to autism. Repeated exposure helps people learn what kinds of things to expect, especially when, as you pointed out, we're dealing with invisible disabilities. So I think you're really onto something there, Scott, with the, perhaps changing the way that we do policing such that officers get to learn the people in their neighborhoods, and the people in the neighborhoods get to learn the officer, and the trust between officer and the people that they're protecting is allowed to grow. And we're getting down to the end of our time. Jeremy, I wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in. As a parent, as my co-parent, as someone who has interacted with officers on the behalf of our children, what are your thoughts about the mental health and the policing and the way that we do things now, and what can be done better?
Well, all of my interactions with the police when it comes to him have been wonderful. So I don't have the experience of someone who has interacted with the police badly in those ways. He has been able to respond to them well, and they've known how to talk to him and how to handle him. So obviously that might have to do partly with the part of the city that we live in, and partly with they knew in advance what they were in for. The message got through to them properly, and they were trained enough to know how to handle that. What would happen if he just sort of takes off in a different part of the city or in a different city, and we can't find him, and someone comes across him and he's doing something unpredictable, something that someone doesn't know how to interpret? Right, that's the case I would worry about. And I would hope that the officers who would encounter him would be trained to be able to recognize that's what's going on, rather than some other thing. And who knows if they would. So I don't have any experience whatsoever to judge that. I've just heard about these stories or seen videos of them where someone obviously doesn't know how to make that assessment. And it makes me think, what business do they have being a police officer to begin with, if they don't know how to handle cases like this? Because they shouldn't have to be told in advance, this is someone who has autism. They shouldn't have to be told that. They should not make any assumptions about it at all, and judge the case by what they see, and think about all the possibilities before they go and try to handle it. And if they're not trained to know how to do that, then something's gone wrong.
Yeah, you make a great point in that, we shouldn't have to tell someone ahead of time, this person is autistic, they're going to act in ways that you might not expect, please don't hurt them. That the assumption should be going in that, I don't know what kind of person I'm going to come across, so I need to be very careful in the way that I interact, and make sure that I'm good with my observations, and that I don't make any assumptions that lead me to make a mistake.
And I think if the only thing we were going to say, I'm totally fine with someone making a call and saying this is a job for a social worker, not a police officer, but the police officers need to know how to handle cases like these, because they're going to come across them. Yes. When no one knows the facts of the situation, and they're given false facts, right? They're given false picture of what's really true, and they're gonna show up thinking something other than what's really going on. They need to know how to handle that well, and if they don't, then something's gone wrong in how they're being trained.
Yes. So I'm hearing that we have high expectations for the abilities of law enforcement to be able to discern what they're looking at when they show up to a call in the neighborhood. We have high expectations that they're going to behave in a way that earns the trust of people who would look to them for help. Now, I also want to get back to a point about, the quality of mental health services, that are available to people with developmental disabilities, particularly those of us who are not interested in verbal communication. That's a chronic shortfall that needs to be addressed. There's also a chronic shortfall in addressing things like depression and anxiety in people with developmental disabilities, because we are at increased risk for those kinds of mental illnesses. With the case of Linden that we've been discussing, that kind of inspired this particular episode of Life Fantastic, he was having anxiety. His behavior was driven by anxiety, and the officer who shot him, you know, we can conclude from the evidence that's available that the officer failed to recognize this kid's behavior as being driven by anxiety. And yes, this is the thing of nightmares of a parent. You know, when I don't sleep at night, it's because I'm worrying about stuff like this. When is my son going to come across an officer who doesn't have the foresight to stop and think, what is it that I'm looking at? Is the first assumption that I come up with, is that true? Is that really what's going on? Is this person running away from me because they're guilty or because there's something that they're terrified of? We need law enforcement officers to be asking those kinds of questions, and we need our civic leaders to be providing them with the training and the resources to be able to ask those kinds of questions and come up with an answer that keeps more people alive and uninjured. So, any last thoughts that you want to share with us? And we'll start with you, Liza.
Well, I just think one thing is, you were talking about under equipped professionals to handle depression and anxiety. And I think that if you keep seeing disability as a negative thing and a thing that, oh, God forbid it would happen to you, you're going to see anxiety and depression as a natural consequence of being a disabled person and not treat them in the same way that you would an able person. I also think in terms of in terms of encounters, that's the word I was looking for, in terms of encounters with law enforcement officers, mental health professionals, anything, we need to stop seeing disabled behavior in general, and especially autistic behavior, as threatening, because and as disruptive, threatening, harmful, anything of that sort. Because if it's anything, it's not threatening or harmful to you. It's threatening or harmful. It's harmful to the person who is going through it more than anything. And if you don't realize that, and you think everything is just threatening to you rather than them, and they are intending to threaten you, or they're intending to do anything of the sort, then you are not going to be equipped to handle that situation, and you aren't going to realize what's actually going on, the stress, the pain, whatever that person is actually going through.
Yeah.
So stop seeing autistic behavior as threatening or harmful.
Yes. Stop seeing the behavior of people with disabilities as threatening.
Yep.
Because we're not. We're trying to get our needs met.
Yep.
Scott, last words?
Yeah, I like to just spin it on a positive note, and this might be a solution that no one's ever really thought of. Think of those with disabilities as someone that's very gifted and has an ability, because some people, some inventors, I don't know if it was Einstein or if it was any of the great inventors, some people might say they were crazy, but they had great ideas. And I think if we tap into that, you're dealing with mental health, you can then deal with police, but then you deal with the piece of education, because I think that's the missing bridge of that triangle is you have to train the schools. Because I've always been an advocate, you have to train the schools when you're introducing someone like myself from a private to a public school. They didn't have a clue. it's hard to influence students. I don't know if you send a letter out, say there's this kid, I don't know, but it's the culture of the schools educates people on disabilities. With modern technology, webinars, you can do all kinds of things. And just like the man without arms, Nick Vujicic, it's hard to say his name, but he always sees the potential. He's traveled the world as a minister, yet with no arms and no legs, except just a little toe that a little bit of a foot that he can move around. But you have to see the potential in the person, because I don't want it all to be negative. Obviously, we have to deal with changing all these other things, but put education, put the police, and put the mental health and the families, and you get a holistic, and put the church involved, get all of society together. And I think that's when the society can begin to heal.
Yes, thank you. I love that. The whole, they call it the holistic approach.
Yeah.
All on deck. Everybody has a role to play. Jeremy, last thoughts?
Yeah, I've just finished reading a book by Michael Emerson and George Yancey that called Transcending Racial Barriers, that has exactly that approach when it comes to race questions. You know, a lot of people have these approaches that say, well, those people are the ones who have to do the work because they're the ones who had the history of being mean to everyone. Now, those people are the ones that need to do it because the problems are within their community. And the reality is we're never going to make any progress when we have very different visions of what we want until we find some common element that unites us all, get together, seek that as the goal, and try to find solutions that capture at least most of what most people want. And I mean, it's the same thing that any marriage counselor would try to seek between two parties who have a disagreement over something, right? What is it that you really want? What's core to both of you? What are you going to try to do to make that happen? And when we have a society with different people who have different goals and different interests and different concerns and different views about how to do things, the only way to make it work is if we're all at the table, all talking, all hearing each other, and all understanding where everyone is coming from, and then trying to find ways to do what everyone wants. And that's the whole point of a system of society like what we have, rather than having a monarchy or an aristocracy or something like that. But we're just not very good at implementing it. We're pretty terrible at implementing it, in fact. So in the big picture, I would totally agree with that approach. I think that's the only way forward on any contentious issue.
Thank you for those last words. Those are great last words, everyone. Especially the thought that we need to come to the table, all of us together, to find the solutions that are going to work, so we don't have another situation where a family calls for help and the person who needs the help ends up injured or dead. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, Liza, Scott, and Jeremy, for being here. I am Samantha Pierce, the Idea Dynamo, and this is Life Fantastic, where we come together at the table to explore all things disability here on Straight Independent Radio. Thank you, and we'll see you next time, where we are going to be discussing the euphemism treadmill. If you haven't heard it, look it up. Euphemism treadmill, where we start with one name and that name becomes an insult, and next thing you know, we got to come up with another name. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that next week, right here on Straight Independent Radio. This is Life Fantastic. We are sponsored by Neurodiversity Consulting and Sentia A Calendar Inc. Check us out on the web. Have a great time. Thank you for joining us. Bye.